The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet truck stop, highlighting the dust that clung to every surface and giving the place a golden, almost tranquil glow. For Maria, this was just another slow day at work. She had been the cashier here for the past couple of years, enough time to learn every corner of this old station and most of the people who passed through. The familiar rumble of engines and distant highway noise was usually the only thing to break the silence. She was just starting to close out the register, planning her evening routine, when she heard the sound of a truck pulling in. Glancing through the window, she saw a man step out, a tall figure whose movements were purposeful and calm. He was dressed in military-style clothing, a small duffel slung over his shoulder, and he carried an air about him that made her pause. There was something unmistakable about the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that didn't need words. He walked toward the pump, his expression unreadable but focused, as if he were on a mission. Maria felt a pang of curiosity. He didn't look like most of the customers who stopped by this out-of-the-way truck stop, and she wondered what had brought him here. She noted his worn boots and the patches on his jacket. A soldier, she thought, feeling a sense of respect. He looked like someone who'd seen things, maybe things he didn't want to talk about. Just as he started filling up his tank, the piece was interrupted by a sound Maria had grown to dread, the low, throaty roar of motorcycles. Her heart sank as she glanced out the window again and saw them. 3 men on hulking bikes, each exuding an air of menace that filled the air as thick as the dust kicked up by their tires. These men were familiar faces around here, part of a gang that the locals had learned to avoid whenever possible. The leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a streaked beard, was known as Jace. Trouble followed wherever he went, and he liked it that way. He was flanked by his usual cronies, one wiry man with a permanent scowl, and another stocky, tattooed man who rarely spoke but had an intimidating presence. Maria's pulse quickened as she watched the bikers roll up, positioning their bikes to block the exits. They seemed to be in a foul mood, and to her dismay, their eyes immediately fell on the soldier at the pump. She hoped he wouldn't notice them, or that he'd hurry and leave, but Jace wasn't the type to let someone slip away once he'd marked them. Jace sauntered over, his face twisted into a mocking grin. The soldier, who Maria had decided to call Ben in her mind, seemed to notice but didn't react. He kept his gaze steady on the pump, calmly filling his tank as if the 3 men looming over him were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Hey there, soldier boy." Jace's voice was loud, dripping with sarcasm. "You lost, or are you just too good for us civilians?" Maria held her breath, feeling a pang of fear for Ben. She wanted to shout, to warn him about the kind of people he was dealing with, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he stood, unmoved by their taunts, or the quiet confidence in his expression. Jace stepped closer, his grin widening as he reached out to grab the small flag patch on Ben's shoulder. "What's the matter, soldier? Cat got your tongue?" Ben gently removed Jace's hand from his shoulder, his grip firm but calm. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable authority. "Let go." The simplicity of his words, the calmness, was more unnerving than if he'd shouted. Jace's grin faltered, but he quickly recovered, letting out a harsh laugh. "What are you going to do, tough guy? There's 3 of us and 1 of you." Maria watched as Ben's stance shifted slightly, his eyes focusing with a laser-like intensity. It was as if a switch had been flipped. He didn't flinch or say another word, but something about him changed in that instant, something even Jace noticed. Without warning, Ben moved. His arm shot out, twisting Jace's wrist just enough to force him to release his grip without causing harm. Jace stumbled back, momentarily off balance, his face a mixture of shock and anger. The other 2 bikers moved in, but Ben was ready. In a series of fluid, calculated motions, he deflected their attempts to grab him, redirecting their own momentum against them. Within moments, all 3 bikers were either stunned or stumbling, their intimidation shattered by a single quiet man who hadn't even broken a sweat. As the bikers staggered, regrouping themselves, Maria could hardly believe what she'd just witnessed. The way Ben had handled the situation, it was unlike anything she'd ever seen. He hadn't escalated the violence, hadn't lashed out in anger. Instead, he'd shown restraint and control. traits that clearly rattled Jace and his gang far more than any show of brute force could have. The bikers exchanged glances before Jace spat on the ground, muttering something under his breath as he turned back to his bike. "We'll be seeing you around, soldier boy," he snarled, his voice filled with a bitter threat. Ben didn't reply, his eyes steady as he watched them mount their bikes and roar away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. When the sound of their engines finally faded, Maria let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She felt an overwhelming urge to thank him, maybe even to ask how he'd learned to handle himself like that. Instead, she simply watched as he finished at the pump, straightened his jacket, and gave her a nod of acknowledgement through the window. It was a small gesture, but somehow it meant everything in that moment. Maria knew this wasn't the last she'd see of Ben. Over the next few days, Maria couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time she heard the rumble of a truck, she found herself glancing out the window, wondering if it was him. When he finally returned one quiet evening, her heart skipped a beat. He was dressed more casually this time, though his posture and demeanor were still unmistakably military. As he walked into the store, his eyes briefly scanned his surroundings before he gave her a polite nod. "Hi there, back for more gas?" Maria asked, trying to keep her tone light. Ben gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Yeah, figured I'd be on the road again soon." There was a pause, and Maria gathered her courage, deciding now was as good a time as any to satisfy some of her curiosity. "You handled those bikers pretty well last time," she said, trying to sound casual. "I've never seen anyone deal with them like that." Ben shrugged slightly, as if it were no big deal. "I've dealt with worse." There was no pride or arrogance in his words, just a simple statement of fact. For him, it was as if facing trouble was second nature. "So, are you like a soldier?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. It was written all over him. The disciplined movements, the steady gaze, the way he was always hyper-aware of his surroundings. "Something like that," he replied, his tone unreadable. Maria nodded, sensing he didn't want to dive into his past. But even without him saying much, she felt like she understood him, at least in part. She'd seen the look in his eyes, the kind of weariness that only came from facing hard times, maybe even loss. "You know, people around here are a little nervous about that biker gang," she said, her voice softening. "They've been causing trouble for a while now. Most folks try to avoid them." Ben looked at her, his gaze steady. Sometimes avoiding trouble only makes it follow you longer. Maria felt a shiver run down her spine at the simple truth in his words. People like Jace and his gang only grew bolder when no one stood up to them. For the first time in a long while, she started to believe things could change. As Ben became a regular at the truck stop, Maria learned little bits and pieces about him, how he'd grown up moving from place to place, how he didn't really have a place to call home, and how the military had given him a sense of purpose. Though he rarely spoke of his time in service, she could see it in the way he carried himself, and in the rare moments when his guard dropped. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maria found herself asking the question that had been on her mind for days. "Why do you keep coming back here?" Ben paused, considering her question. "Maybe I just like the coffee," he said with a slight smile. But there was a hint of something else in his eyes, a softness that suggested he might be staying for more than just the coffee. As the days passed, the tension in town began to shift. Maria noticed her regular customers seemed a little braver, a little more willing to stand their ground. She couldn't help but think it had something to do with Ben. His quiet strength had a way of inspiring people, and the story of his standoff with Jace had spread like wildfire. But Jace wasn't the type to take humiliation lightly. Rumors began to swirl that he was planning something big. Maria worried about what might happen next, but she found comfort in knowing Ben was still around. For the first time in years, the truck stop and the town felt like it had a fighting chance.